So Joomla in the Enterprise, not this Enterprise. This is the obligatory Star Trek Enterprise joke that every Enterprise talk has to include. So how do you guys watch, well, before I say that, we're going to have a little bit of fun before we start talking about that stuff, or what I think is fun. I don't know. You might not find it fun, but we'll try to have a little bit of fun. So instead of the standard, about me slide where I tell you all about who I am, and we're gonna play a little bit of a game, a little bit of crowd participation. So, how many of you guys ever watched the show The Mentalist? Anybody? Yeah. You know what it's about? The premise is so it's a guy that he's a consultant for the California Bureau of Investigation. He was a psychic in his former life, and but basically that meant he was really good at reading people. He wasn't really a psychic. He was a mentalist, so he could look at you and tell you your life history just based on what he's observed about you. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you a picture, and I'm going to see how many facts about me you can uncover based on this picture, okay? I'm not going to tell you anything about me. Some of you already know stuff about me, so don't cheat and say it, but okay. So here's a picture. I'll give you a hint. These are my kids.
Your wife is blonde.
There you go. That's a good one. You're right. You are correct.
You're a cat person.
No. Not at all. There's no animal rights activists in the room, are there?
Are there twins there?
I can't stand cats. My wife loves cats, and I would not be kind to cats if I had one. So I'm very nice to animals. I wouldn't hurt a cat. I just don't like them. Anyone else? There's context clues in the picture.
Like you outside. You don't know your lawn.
Maybe. It's not my lawn. Good guess, though.
Do you tiptoe through the flowers?
No. I'll give you a hint. Pay attention to the type of flowers. Anybody know what kind of flower this is? Nobody?
Something to do with Texas.
Bluebell? Bluebonnets?
There you go. So what does that tell you about me?
Yeah.
I'm from Texas. That's right. Very good. Anybody else? Any other guesses? There's some not so obvious.
You're from Waco.
I am from Waco, yes.
But I do that already.
I work for Sears, yes. This is for like 2 or 3 days ago. So if you live in Texas, every spring the bluebonnets come out, and they're all over the place. They're everywhere. And it's kind of an unwritten rule that you have to take a picture of your kids in the bluebonnets if you have kids. So that's anyway.
Nice.
That was my fun little game. I hope y'all had fun. It was fun for me. So I have 3 kids. I'm from Texas. I know all the words to "Let It Go" from the Frozen soundtrack. Does anybody else know the words to that?
Rock it out.
I could sing it for you right now if you'd like.
Yeah.
But I won't.
Let it go.
Let it go.
Let it go.
Yeah. That starts off with "The snow glows white on the mountain tonight."
But the cold doesn't bother you.
The cold doesn't bother me anyway. Yeah, so I do, and I actually know the words to several other songs on the soundtrack, but that's the one that everybody else knows. My daughter has the soundtrack, and she listens to it on repeat all the time, and she sings it, and so, you kind of learn the words. And let me show you my kids again. Okay, so now look at that last one. That's the truth. We spend a lot of money on sunscreen. My wife and I both have about pretty much the same complexion. We look like siblings. We dated in college, and people looked at us and were like, "Are y'all dating? Are you brother and sister?" It got really confusing for a while there because we were broken up, but we were still kind of friends. And we were like, well, we're not either of those. So anyway, sorry. So I like to talk about things that have nothing to do with what I actually brought you here to talk about. So occasionally I'll throw in random side things that make no sense, and they're funny to me, and they might be funny to you, or they might not be. But the agenda for today, so we are talking about Joomla in the Enterprise. Specifically, so I work for Sears, like we mentioned, and specifically, it's more or less a case study of how we do things with this particular website that I work on in Sears. It's not Sears.com. I have nothing to do with that website. I work on an internal website, and it's a site that's used by about 1,000 or so employees of Sears for communication and collaboration. And so what I want to talk about is how we have the site set up and how things are structured so that we can run the site efficiently and effectively within an enterprise situation. So I want to talk first about the network architecture, kind of how things are set up with the servers and other things. Then I want to talk about the tools that we use. So some non-Joomla tools that might not be as obvious to people who are, kind of live their lives within Joomla. Some things that outside of Joomla that really I think are useful and should be used in a lot of web development processes. And then also some Joomla tools, the Joomla tools that we use that you probably use a lot of the same ones. So, you don't necessarily think about them as being enterprise tools, and they're not per se, but Joomla is one of those things where it's not an enterprise tool per se, but you can use it in enterprise if you have the supporting infrastructure set up to run it. So, and also talk a little bit about our workflow and how we go about our process of managing releases and deployment and things like that for the website. So first, let's talk about network architecture. So we have 3 environments. So there's 3 completely different network environments with their own servers, their own database servers, and things like that. So the first is a development environment, or dev. We call that, it's kind of like the Wild West. Anything goes. Install whatever you want, build whatever you want, do whatever you want on dev, break it if you need to, or to kind of test things out. We have a QA environment, and that's it's for testing. So it's going to be pretty similar to what's on production. It's going to be kind of the next level up from what's on production, because it's what we're getting ready to deploy to production, and so that we can test it in an environment that's as close to production as possible. So we can make sure that we've gone through and fixed any kind of bugs that might be occurring. And then our last environment is the production environment, which production obviously is what's live. It's what people are actually using. The end user is actually seeing what's in production. We also use what's called a continuous integration server. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. That's what we use for our deployment. Basically, deployment is clicking a button. It's great. So I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. We also have an Elasticsearch server. So how many of you guys use Joomla's search feature within your website? Right. Okay. How many of you have used Joomla's smart search feature on Joomla 2.5 or 3.0 or whatever? Okay. So as the site gets larger and more content, the smart search feature, at least for our purposes, became a little bit, it wasn't quite up to the task. And so Elasticsearch is a standalone server that sits outside of the Joomla server. And so rather than indexing all of our content into the Joomla database, which is what the smart search tools do, we actually index the content into this Elasticsearch server. And so when a user comes in and enters a search query, it doesn't query the Joomla database, it queries the Elasticsearch server. It's the same end result to the end user, but it's a little bit faster, a little more efficient. And it also takes the search processing outside of the main web server. We also have a GitHub server, so you can use github.com. Obviously, we have an enterprise license where we have GitHub installed on a server within our network, because obviously as a larger company, we need to have a closed environment that other people can't have access to. And finally, we have an LDAP server. So this is basically Active Directory. It's where all of the enterprise user accounts are stored, and so whenever you log into the corporate network, it's authenticating you against this LDAP server. So this is more or less a diagram of the dev and QA environments. So this is a firewall. Is that pretty? I found that online. I was looking for icons, like, okay, firewall icon. There, that's a firewall. So basically, you have to be inside the firewall to access any of these servers. So you guys will never be able to see these unless you're logged into the Sears corporate network. So basically, we have a web server, a database server. The web server accesses the Elasticsearch server. And then we also have on the network the LDAP JCI, which J is Jenkins. That's the brand name of the continuous integration server. And then GitHub. So these are all on the same network. So that's what the dev and QA environments look like. Okay, and I'm going to post these slides, so don't feel like you need to draw this really quickly, unless you want to.
Where do you post them at?
I'll post my Twitter account here on the end, and I'll I'm going to post them on SlideShare, and then I'll link to them from my Twitter account. And then they should be on the video, so you should be able to have access to it. This is the production environment. It's a little more robust, a little bit more hardware involved. So if one thing fails, you're not necessarily out of luck. You have the other one to fall back on. So now this is an environment that you can actually hit from the internet. It's an intranet site, but we recently opened it up beyond the firewall so that employees who are maybe don't have VPN, but they want to get onto this particular website to communicate, they can. But then behind the firewall, so the web server still has access to all this other stuff through the firewall. We have the LDAP and JCI server and the GitHub server. And then rather than just a single database server and a single web server, we've got, you're actually hitting a load balancer, a web server load balancer that's governs whether or not you're pulling content from web server 1 or web server 2. So there's 2 web servers plus a load balancer, okay? And then those obviously access the Elasticsearch server. And then we also have a database load balancer. So for the database, we have 2 database servers as well that are just mirroring each other. And so it's the load balancer basically balances the load. Any questions about that so far? I mean, it's all pretty standard stuff. I mean, if you're into network architecture and network setups. Now, to be quite honest, this is probably overkill for 95% of Joomla websites, maybe more than 95% of Joomla websites. But this is what we do. It's, for our environment, we need to have it available and so that it's not going to go down easily and quickly. So, you get a picture. Oh, we're waiting on you, Matt.
Got it.
Let's go.
Thanks.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools that we use. So I mentioned Jenkins CI server or continuous integration server. How many of you guys are familiar with Jenkins? A few of you. Good. This is a tool I hadn't really heard of before I came to Sears, and one of the network guys was saying this is what we need to use for the continuous integration. And continuous integration basically means anytime you push a change or you commit a change to Git, you can deploy it easily and quickly through a tool like Jenkins. So basically, what Jenkins allows us to do is it allows us to schedule tasks like command line arguments or command line commands. You can schedule it in Jenkins to run, every 5 minutes or every 1 week or 2 weeks, or you can go in and push a button that says deploy the latest changes to the production server. And so that's what we use Jenkins for, and it's a great tool. It's one of those things that I think every project should have, to a certain extent, something like this, some way that whenever you need to make changes to one of your clients' websites, you should have the ability as a professional web developer to do like this one click or one button deployment. So to be honest, I never had anything like this when I was doing this full time, for clients. And so it's one of those things like I'm trying to, that's why I brought it up here, is I want to convince you guys this is a very useful tool. It's something that I think people should learn and be using in their processes. We also use GitHub. Every change that we make, everything that we do is all committed through Git. We don't do anything that's not somehow tracked and watched through Git. So we use a GitHub server for that for the managing all of our Git repos. Yes, Victor.
For your database information also?
No, database stuff is a little bit different. And so I'm not really going to get into database stuff, but essentially we use Jenkins actually for some of the database stuff. It's a good question. No, I am going to get into database stuff. Thanks. So we use Jenkins for database stuff. So we have a command to basically copy the production database and then put it into the QA database or put it into the dev database. So we can easily sync what's in production down into QA and dev so that at any point, because, over time, what's in production, what's in QA, what's in dev, those all become radically different over time because you're in dev, it's Wild West, you're doing whatever the heck you want. QA, it's pretty close to production, but it's not quite the same. And you're also in production, especially on a site like we have, where it's more of a social kind of site. There's users are adding content all the time. That's not getting into QA and dev ever unless you do some kind of a synchronization. So we use Jenkins. There's a QA database deploy process. We just click a button and say build it. And then there's a dev database deploy process where we do the same thing. And it syncs it up between the three. So that's essentially what we do. But basically, if we make a change that requires a database change, so for example, if we're installing a new extension, the way that I go about that, and might not be the best way to do it, but it's the way that works for me, is on my local host, I'll do a dump of the database, so I'll have a database data SQL file and a database schema SQL file, and I commit those into a GitHub repo, a separate repo from our main repo. I'll commit those as kind of the baseline snapshot, and then I'll install whatever extension it is that I'm installing, do another dump of the data and the schema, commit those into Git, and then I'll look at the differences between the files, and that helps me figure out, okay, what schema changes do I need to make, what data changes do I need to make. So then when it actually happens, I just have an SQL file with a few queries that I can run on QA and production. So it's from the opposite end, rather than production down, it's from bottom up, making those changes. So that's a long way of saying dealing with DB stuff is kind of a pain, but there's not really a good, efficient way to do it yet, as far as I know. Maybe I'm wrong. Somebody? Huh? Not really. Yeah, not for this kind of thing, because what's happening is, in this case, so if I install an extension, it's making a handful of small changes on my localhost database, for example. I'm installing it on localhost to test it first. And so those changes, I don't want to put my whole localhost database up on the server, because that's going to overwrite what's been done on production. So what I want those specific changes, and the only way there's really not an easy, efficient way to do it, as far as I know. Yes?
I haven't looked at it in a long time, but there are things like, I just blanked on the name, but some database compare tools that you can say, just look at these tables on the schema, but I never was able to quite get it enough to get Joomla to be happy with.
Yeah, that stuff, so it's a bit of a manual process for us, because you still, there's certain tools like you're talking about where it automatically compares, but we essentially have 4 databases. So you got production, QA, dev, and then whatever's on your local host. So really it's more than that, because there's other local hosts. And anyway, so that kind of stuff is hard to deal with, because you don't, doing the comparisons, you don't know if you're comparing A to A or A to B or whatever. So, it's a bit of a manual process and kind of a pain. So that's how we deal with database stuff. Let me move on. The next thing that we work with is called Selenium and PHP Unit. So Selenium is a browser tool that does, you can set up macros where it'll go through your site automatically and test. So basically, think of it like you set it up to record what you're doing, and you go in there and you click on different things within your site. Selenium records that, and then it does it for you, and so it's testing aspects of your site from the front end, and so it's automated testing basically. And the PHP unit is the same thing, but it's on the server side, and you can actually use the two in conjunction with each other to do some pretty nice automated testing. And so we have this checklist of things that we have to test before every deployment to make sure that we don't mess something up, so we don't want to push out a broken product. And there's so many nuanced little things within the site that we've got to go through this big checklist, and it's a real pain. So with this automated testing setup, we click a button and let it run. It takes a little bit of time, but it's so much faster than if I were to manually go through and test every little thing. So there's a few things that we still have to manually test that don't necessarily work well within this kind of setup, but it saves us so much time in testing. So I definitely recommend it especially if you do a lot of testing, or if you have a lot of tedious manual things. Yes?
Is that open source also?
Yes. Yeah. Did you have a question, Tom?
I was just going to ask, the Selenium and the PHP unit, did you manually run that, or do you run that through Jenkins?
It's manual at this point, yeah. Because the Selenium is actually running in your own browser. It's not running on a server somewhere.
Well, yeah, because you can do a web drive. You can have web drivers with different browsers.
Yeah.
Doing it on. I know that Mozilla does that for Firefox.
Okay.
They have the whole thing, and then you can also use something like Sauce Labs. But I was just curious how you guys use it.
Sauce Labs is what we use to test remotely. There's some load testing you can do. It's Selenium test run in the cloud, basically.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you have a resource for the Selenium, like testing, like a checklist that like a normal site will go through?
No, because it varies. So your site's going to look different from our site. You're going to have different UI features on your site than what we have, and so
You just have to do it from scratch, right?
yeah. So you're going to want to test to make sure that every all the links are in your header that you expect to be there. You're going to want to make sure that all the everything's there that you expect to be there. So there's not really a checklist. You have to kind of make your own. Yeah. But once you make it, this goes through it all for you, rather than you make it, then you got to run the checklist on your manually, and then you got to do it again, and you got to do it again. So Selenium and PHP unit, those are excellent tools that save you a ton of time. Elasticsearch, I mentioned it a little bit earlier. Again, Elasticsearch is it's an open source tool. You can install it on a server, and then you can index all of your content to Elasticsearch and run all of your search queries through that tool. So it's not quite as simple as I'm making it sound, but it's one of those things. If you're working on a site with a ton of content, it's definitely worth the effort to go through to integrate a tool like Elasticsearch. There's others out there. There's like Solar is another search engine kind of system. So, and then finally, we use APC cache, alternative PHP caching, just to help with the performance on the server. And so one of the things that we do every time we do a deployment, we have to clear the APC cache so that the changes actually show up on the server. But that's another thing that we're using as well. Yes?
Does that imply that you're using PHP 5.4 or 5.3? Or not?
I mean, you guys are wrong. I don't know the exact version that we're using. Hold on, I'm not sure. I think it's 5.4, but I'm not sure. Any other questions? So here's the Joomla tools that we use. So Joomla Social, obviously, like I mentioned, it's a social site. We're also using EasyBlog, so it's a way for users to log in and write their own blog posts and communicate what they're working on with their colleagues. We use AC Mailing. You'd be surprised at what a good newsletter solution can do within a large corporate environment. People are really impressed with it because they have the ability to generate really nice looking newsletters and send it out to their departments or to their employees or whatever. So we use AC Mailing for that. MailChimp or a hosted solution like that doesn't necessarily fit within this kind of environment. And so we're using AC Mailing. I know there's other alternatives for Joomla, but that's the one that we are using. JCE, obviously, Joomla Content Editor for WYSIWYG. I mean, I don't know if I need to even say it, but it's kind of the de facto one that we use for everything. So we also use the LDAP authentication plugin. I don't know if you guys are even aware that even comes with Joomla. Joomla has an LDAP authentication plugin. You go in and set up the configuration with your LDAP server information, and it handles everything for you. So when the user logs into the site, so users that come to our site for the first time, they don't have to sign up. They just log in with their corporate ID, and what Joomla does is it'll go ping the LDAP server and say, hey, are these credentials good? It says yes, okay, you're in. And if they're a new user, it generates a new Joomla user ID on the fly for them. If they're not a new user, then it starts the session with their existing Joomla user ID. Some custom stuff that we've done. We built the LDAP sync tool. So basically, in a large corporate environment, there's turnover. People come and go. And so as people leave, we needed a way to basically disable their accounts within our website. They're disabled in LDAP, so they can't log into the corporate environment, but they can't log into our site anymore, but we still need to disable their accounts. So the LDAP sync tool basically periodically it runs, it pings LDAP, says, for all the active users, says, is this person still here? Yes, okay, do nothing. If they're not still here, let's disable the account. Elasticsearch plugin, so we had to do a lot of custom development to integrate the Elasticsearch tool. And then the avatar generator, this is something that I built. So this is what a typical avatar looks like on the website. It's basically, there's a little algorithm that it goes through where it takes your user ID and then it generates a little geometric kind of pattern based on your user ID. So everybody has their own unique avatar based on the user ID. So GitHub does something similar, WordPress does something similar, so we're doing that because people weren't happy with the Jump Social default avatars for some reason. So that's what that's all about. It has nothing to do with enterprise. It's just, well, it does actually, because in enterprise, when the VP isn't happy with something, you find a solution. When you find a solution to fix it, so that's what that's all about. That's a picture of Paul Orwig. Would have been funny to Vic if he had stayed, but he left. Vic put this picture up twice in his keynote this morning, and I thought, man, he's got an unhealthy obsession with Paul Orwig. So anyway, that's Paul. He was the president of OSM, and he's going.
Could be the Heineken he did that.
It could be. All right, so workflows, and I'm going to try to go kind of fast through this, so we can have a little bit of time for questions. But feel free to stop me and ask questions along the way, so that you don't have to remember it. So we have bi-weekly releases. I looked up the word bi-weekly in the dictionary to make sure that I'm using it correctly, and it actually has two definitions. It means twice a week or once every 2 weeks. So I mean the once every 2 weeks version of bi-weekly, okay? So we do releases once every 2 weeks. It's on a pretty set schedule. The reason we do that is because we get a lot of requests for things, and a lot of times it's like, we want this now, and then it's like, hey, that broke the request that I just asked you for urgently broke something because you didn't test it thoroughly enough because I asked you for it now and didn't give you time to test it thoroughly enough. So we have this bi-weekly release schedule that basically says you can ask us for stuff, but it's not going in until, we'll schedule it for one of our next releases, not the next one because we're already working on the next one, but maybe the following one or something like that. So that's how that works. We deploy on Wednesday. The development has to be completed Friday prior to the Wednesday so that we have Monday and Tuesday to do the more thorough testing. And then the final testing has to be completed in QA before we will release it to production. Man. There you go.
Must go back.
It's Vic's favorite person. All right. So we also, like I mentioned, we use Git. So here's a little bit about how we use it. We've got three main branches. We've got the master branch, which is always the same as what's in production. We've got the QA branch, and it always matches what's in QA. So whenever you push a change to the QA branch, you immediately deploy it into the QA server so that you can start testing it. And that's happening throughout the 2-week process. It's not just on Friday before the release. It's ongoing. And then once QA is tested and we've got the green light, yes, everything's good, it's ready to go, then we merge it from QA into the master right before we do the release. So we also have a fix branch. This is more for emergencies. And so we're kind of, anytime we make a change to master, we pull that down into fix to keep it synchronized with master. And then if we ever have to make a change, like a quick emergency change, we do it in the fix branch, merge it immediately into production so that we can put it into the master branch so we can put it into production and bypass the whole QA process because it's something that has to go in pretty quickly. So something's broken or something, that's pretty rare, but that's what it's there for. We also have task-specific branches. So, for example, like if I'm upgrading Jump Social, that might be something that spans over a couple of releases, and so, or it might not. It depends on how complicated it is. But if I'm upgrading Jump Social, I'll create a Jump Social branch, do what I need to do, merge it into QA, and then delete that branch because I don't need it anymore. So that's a good thing about Git. You can make as many branches as you want and delete them whenever you don't need them. So, and then we also have checks and balances. So essentially, we never merge our own pull requests. So there's a couple of us that work on this site. So anytime I do a pull request, I send it to the person I'm working with and say, hey, I've got this pull request, can you check it out and merge it for me? And vice versa, she'll do the same thing. And so that way, there's just a little bit of accountability there. So typically, it's for small changes. It wouldn't be a big deal if we did merge our own, but it's better just for the accountabilities, or for the sake of accountability, to merge each other's things rather than merge our own. So if you're working by yourself, obviously that's not possible. So don't worry about that. But if you're working in a team, yes.
So along the lines of checks and balances, do you guys do your own QA or does someone else do QA?
We do our own QA. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. So another thing as far as checks and balances, on production and QA servers on the DB, we don't have access to actually make any schema changes on those servers. And so anytime we have to do a schema change, we got to go through a request process and have somebody in the DBA department make those schema changes for us. It's a bit of a pain, but for the sake of accountability, it's actually kind of a good thing, because I can't, they don't let us shoot ourselves in the foot because we can't, it's not possible. So environment. So like I mentioned, we have the local host. We do a lot of development locally. I don't do a whole lot on the dev server unless I need to do something that I'm showing somebody that I'm working with. I do a lot of stuff locally. I track changes in a local repo. I'll check out a branch, whatever branch I'm working on, and make the changes. I don't ever make changes to the master branch on my local host. Anything that goes into master is usually going to be merged from QA or from fix. Make my changes, commit them, push them to GitHub, and I keep track of the DB changes, like I mentioned to you earlier, where I do the database dump and then kind of do the DB compare and things like that. So that's on local host. On a dev environment, like I said, it's a Wild West. Basically, have at it. Do whatever you need to do. Build a new component or install whatever you need to do. Prototype new stuff. And like I also mentioned earlier, we periodically will sync this with production using Jenkins. In QA, so we deploy updates from the GitHub QA repo from Jenkins. So there's a Jenkins process called QA deploy. We go to QA deploy build, and that's it. And it takes whatever's in the QA repo, puts it on the QA server, and that's it. It takes about 2 minutes. So we do the thorough testing, we do some manual testing, and then we also go through the Selenium PHP unit stuff. And then we always complete the testing prior to the release to production. And then we periodically, like I said, we'll sync this database with production as well using Jenkins. Yeah?
How many people on the team, and are you QAing your own code, or is it, you guys switch off, like, hey, you QA my stuff and I
Yeah. So there's 2 of us now, and you QA your own stuff. So yeah, there's not a whole lot of resources for this particular website. So in production, again, we deploy updates from the master repo using Jenkins. It only contains tested and approved updates. So it's, anything that goes into production has been thoroughly tested and vetted, and we make sure that it's not going to break anything, so that the user experience is consistent for everyone. All right, any questions? And this is my Twitter handle, @Cory Webb, CORYWEBB. That's the correct way to spell Cory. If you ever meet somebody named Cory and they spell it differently, they're wrong. Yeah. Yeah. Be embarrassed for them, honestly. Wow. COREY? Who does that? Vic, yes.
What do you miss about going from an independent business owner to being an employee?
I miss the autonomy and the independence.
No, that's the definition. What do you miss about?
What else do I miss about it? I don't know. I miss the long Skype chats with you today.
But you and Paul.
Yeah, there you go. Any other questions?
Do you also do the Sears Holding website?
No.
The corporate?
No, yeah, we just work on one specific website. It's an internal employees only website.
Did this site exist before you started working with them?
Yeah, so they built it about a year and a half ago, and then I started working last June.
How's y'all are using open LDAP server to sync everything in, the users, or just?
So LDAP basically it's used for authentication. So the authentication plugin will go to the LDAP server and determine if whoever's trying to log in, it'll determine if they actually have an account at LDAP and if their password is correct, and then let them in.
I'm working on a site right now that has like a similar situation, but the users have been exclusively independent up to this point of their kind of single sign-in process.
Yeah.
So
the LDAP sync tool that we built basically will go. It's just something that we have to run with like cron job, where it'll periodically go and check LDAP. It goes through the entire database of active users. It pings LDAP to see if they're still in it. If they're not, then it disables their account. LDAP doesn't actively come into our site and tell us whether or not they're there. We have to go ask it, basically.
What Joomla version are you using?
The latest stable. We might not have the latest specific minor update, but we're on 3.2 something, or 3. Yeah, no, 3.3 is not out yet. We're on 3.2 something. We will be on 3.3 probably shortly.
In your department area, your group, how many people are in it? And in terms of sort of corporate oversight, is there a lot of manipulation there, or is it pretty autonomous?
That's an interesting question. So within the people that work on this particular website, there are 2 of us. Within our team, we're on the portals team, and there's like 8 people. But we've been pretty autonomous up to this point. There's not a whole lot of oversight. There was a vice president within the department that we served that was pretty vocal about what he wanted on the site, and so like the avatar thing. But he's not as vocal anymore.
All right, John Social went through a change of ownership here lately. What's been your experience with it? Better, worse? I mean,
I don't want to compare because I don't know. I hadn't used John Social in a while before this, and so I don't know what it had become or what it was like. But it's from an experience standpoint, it's pretty similar to what it used to be. So,
from a software stability standpoint,
I would say it's pretty stable. They've really put a lot of effort into, they do a lot of unit testing and things, and they put a lot of work into it. So to me, it's a great product. I'm also really interested in Easy Social from Stack Ideas. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's another great product that's just come out. If you're building any kind of a social website where you need that kind of functionality, it's certainly worth evaluating the 2 different products. So I won't mention any other ones. Yes.
Is this workflow just for your department, or is it just like a company-wide?
This is what we've established for ourselves. So I know there's been some talk about establishing some set guidelines for how software projects should be run. It's pretty similar to what we're doing anyway. So essentially, make sure that you go through a thorough enough process of testing, and you've got the release cycle and that kind of thing. Any other questions?
In terms of what goes into the site, in terms of extensions and that, is that pretty much you just get requests and then you figure out what could possibly handle it?
Yeah. So it was built before I got there, and they kind of had an idea of what they wanted it to do. And so a lot of the decisions for that were made based on what they wanted the site to do. And then since then, it's based on if we get requests for things that either it doesn't already do, or if it's something that If it's something like an extension that exists that we can leverage, we'll do that. Or sometimes we have to create our own thing. The Elasticsearch thing is a good example. I mean, there's nothing out there in Joomla for Elasticsearch, so you're going to have to create your own, unfortunately. Yeah?
That's a great lead. I was going to ask you, approximately what percentage of the site is third-party existing extensions versus custom extensions that you created?
So in terms of what people use, the bulk of the site is Joomla Social. So in terms of what's installed, it's probably 50-50.
A lot of back-end stuff, plugins and whatnot.
Right. Yeah.
Do you use something like Jira to handle the requests coming in and who's working on what? Or what do you use to handle who's working on what kind of workflow?
Yeah, so in terms of who's working on what, we use GitHub for that. GitHub issues for managing that. I mean, there's two of us, so it's pretty easy to manage that kind of stuff. In terms of like requests that come in, we've actually installed Magma Help Desk, MAQMA. I didn't mention that because we're actually moving away from that because there's a corporate support ticket system that we have to start using. I'd rather use Magma, frankly, but I don't even know how you pronounce it. It's
Magma. It's got a Q in it.
Yeah, it's got a Q in it. MAQMA. iMagma Help Desk. It's a really great tool. It's very robust and very useful. So that's what we use for support requests now. We will be using the corporate support request system.
The plugin you wrote for Elasticsearch, is that something you can share with the community?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to find that out. I didn't write it. My partner wrote it, but she. It's not just one. So if you look in the plugins, in the Smart Search plugins, for every component there's a separate Smart Search plugin because each component, their content's just structured differently. So the plugin is what goes out and grabs the content and indexes it into the database. So basically, what we did, or what she did, was she took the Smart Search plugins and just kind of retooled them to, instead of indexing to the database, they index to the Elasticsearch server. And it's a good question. If we could share it, I mean, we totally would, because I think it's really useful.
I think legally, since you forked the Smart Search plugins, they're under GPL, right? So the only rule will be whether or not you want to get it extra distributed.
Yeah,
That's up to you guys.
But the problem with distributing software is that you then end up having to support it.
Unless
even if you distribute it for free.
Even if you say you don't support, well, unless it goes into core.
That's a fair point.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll talk to Andy, see if we can do it. I mean, it's not her decision. It's obviously we have to. It's above our pay grade. Do what?
I can see that at least being considered before.
Yeah, for sure.
Why not?
Does that involve setting up a third server or a second server?
Well, I mean, Elasticsearch isn't for everybody. I would say, arguably, I would say, this is me making up statistics out of thin air, but I would say 80% of websites, the regular search component is sufficient, and then the other percentage use Smart Search. But of those, Smart Search, there's probably a handful that Smart Search is not sufficient. I mean, for us, Smart Search was not sufficient because we're indexing a ton of content, and you end up the Smart Search database grows exponentially the more content you got. So,
And even if it's not in core, it could be one of the new official Joomla extensions. So it doesn't have to be in core itself.
That's the solution.
The Joomla project extension. How confusing that is.
It's a distro, an enterprise distro.
There you go. That's not
I mean, setting up an Elasticsearch server is definitely something for higher end companies that know what they're doing. So, how much traffic?
Yeah, how much traffic do you think you make that decision? Hey, I need to.
It's not about the traffic, it's about the volume of content. Because Yeah, so, I mean, with Smart Search, if you've got, for every article or for everything you add, what it does is it indexes every single word, and there's all these, okay, there's all these different database entries for indexing just one article, and then you add more articles, and it just balloons. It gets huge. So all of a sudden, you've got this really loaded database when you get a ton of content. So
are you able to turn Smart Search off then as a plugin and not have it build that finer database?
Yeah. It's off by default in Joomla anyway.
Yeah, and so all the plugin, you go into the plugin manager, you find all the Smart Search plugins, and you disable them. Yeah. But they're already, like you said, they're already disabled by default anyway. We were using Smart Search, and our database got to be.
Yeah, we have a few instances of that ourselves.
Is there a reason that you use Elastic instead of like Solid?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah. From what I understand, I think Elasticsearch is kind of becoming the bigger, better project. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know enough about it to give you an intelligent answer. So.
Do you have any other authentication plugins installed that you're actually using still? Like the standard? So it's just that.
The standard Joomla one is still there, and we use it because we have like a couple of test accounts that are not Joomla or that are not enterprise ID accounts because we need to be able to log in as standard users because our accounts are obviously super users and we see things that other people don't see, and we need to be able to see exactly what they see. So we do use that one still, sort of.
So you said that there was like a portion of the site that's like public-ish.
Well, the site you can access the site from outside the firewall. You can't access anything in the site without logging into it. We basically have a plugin. That's another thing. We have a plugin installed that it will, if you're not logged in, it redirects you to a specific page that's just a login screen. So the average, anybody that hits the site, they're going to see a login screen. So you have to be able to log in to see it. But it's not behind the firewall. So.
Do you worry about like the publishing settings of like articles and stuff like that, or is it just?
How does the ACL trickle down with the LDAP system?
It's unrelated.
So you can't,
we have we use our own ADL system or ACL system.
Once they get in.
Do what?
Once they get in, you just have.
Once they get in, so they'll join groups in John Social, and then we have a tool. There's another tool. I didn't think about this one. There's a tool that will, once they join a group, it'll place them in a related ACL group. So we have a lot of ACL groups, unfortunately, which is a problem. And there's actually a bug in Joomla. In the global configuration, if you have a lot of ACL groups, the global configuration doesn't save. So, yeah. So you have to manually go in and change the global configuration.
How many ACL groups is that? Because that's something.
A lot, like 100 and something, 200 maybe.
That's one you would never see.
Yeah, it's not a usual. Yeah.
So is that just like manual, or do you just have like custom scripts based on who they are from Active Directory that puts them in?
It has nothing to do with who they are in Active Directory.
So they join themselves, or you?
They'll join a group once they join a particular group, and it's based on that group.
So when they come in, they're just basically probably a registered user.
Yeah, and so if somebody like a VP will email us and say, "I need to be able to access, I need to be a super user or an administrator, or I need this person to be an administrator, or I need this person to have access to the newsletter component on the front end," or we will manually do it. Yeah, but somebody above our pay grade has to request it. Somebody with the power to tell us what to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of front end, back end stuff, do you have an idea how much content gets generated from the front end versus the back end?
It's all front end, yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, because we've created a few standard like instructional kind of pages a long time ago. We don't really touch those anymore. That's kind of the extent of the front end content. Everything else is user generated. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have any like performance issues with like Easy Blog as far as it's like JavaScript use or anything like that?
Not really, no.
Yeah, it's loads of JavaScript.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay. Time's up. Yeah. So I guess we're done. If there's any more questions, feel free to come up to me. Thank you.